Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of the week, but some really cracking shows coming up for you next. As always, don't forget to click like and subscribe, visit my guests' websites, buy their books, etc., etc. Anyway, right now, we dip into the pre-war era with a look at the British and Indian troops on the northwest frontier from 1936 to 1939. Jon Pick joins us to examine the campaign, and I'm sure we will see evidence of tactics and methods taken forward into World War II, whilst also looking backwards at the previous campaigns in that part of the world. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Jon. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, and you are one of those examples of someone who watched a show and then came to me with a pitch of another show. You watched the show with Mike Tickner and said, I've got something that will complement that, and I love that, folks. So if you're watching something on World War II TV and you think that you've got another angle that supports, connects, adapts, improves upon it, please get in touch. But Jon, just before we get into launch into your presentation, tell us a little bit about yourself. So you are one of UK's premier military book dealers, but you've also got this kind of obsessional interest in this era we're talking about. So how did that all start?
Well, I'm a book dealer, and it came from a book. And the book is one that Mike Tickner mentioned, which is Bugles and a Tiger by John Masters. I read this book many, many years ago, and it's what got me into not just the Northwest frontier, but the British Army in India as a whole. But it was only reasonably recently that I discovered how well photographed the campaign was. And I found that I could buy photograph albums that illuminated the book to an extent that made me want to read more and find out more. And that's how this year-long obsession began, really.
Brilliant. And what I like about is the fact that there's an importance in straddling the eras, in that you do meet these sort of purist historians who I'm strictly Western Front, First World War, or I'm strictly American Civil War, whatever it would be. But if you understand one, it helps you understand the other. And the interwar period is a era that I've got really into in the last few years, because you just see that out of the First World War, there's a way of doing things, and then things go backwards to some extent in the 20s and 30s, then it goes forwards again. And it gives us a more all-round picture. And I just have to reference JD's rather amusing comment in their history on it. This is quite timely. I was just complaining to my friends this morning about how little the Waziristan. Yeah. Typical sarcasm for JD there. So but anyway, I'm going to bring up your slides. So folks, feel free to sort of jump in with questions, but I think for most of us, it's going to be a pretty steep learning curve today. But obviously, Jon is happy to kind of answer any queries as we're going to go along. And when you sent me the slides, like you, I was amazed at how many photos you had. I thought there's going to be like 3 of this campaign. But
I've got over 1,000, Woody.
So, over to you, sir.
Right. Okay. So this is really intended to be a visual canter to give an overview of what I suspect is a relatively little-known theatre for most people watching. We'll set the scene, give an overview of how the campaign progressed, and look at a couple of particularly interesting actions that I feel illustrate the nature of frontier warfare. Rather than try and describe each skirmish, it's not a campaign with front lines and ground taken and held. There's no maps with big arrows and stuff. That doesn't work. So we talked briefly about Bugles and a Tiger, which is a very important book on the subject, written by a guy called John Masters, who was a Gurkha officer who served on the frontier. And in World War II, he commanded a Chindik brigade, and then he served with 19th Indian Division in Burma. As I think he was the senior staff officer to Pete Reese, who was a commander of that division, a very well-known Burma name. I don't know if anyone in the sidebar has read the book, but if you have, I'd be fascinated to know. Okay. Right, so moving on. The Northwest frontier in this context refers to the frontier between what was British India and what was the independent kingdom of Afghanistan. It's now really the frontier between Pakistan and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And that big blue arrow is pointed towards Pakistan on a world map, just to sort of give us a quick clue about what we're talking about. And then this map, maybe a bit smaller, is a period map of the Northwest frontier. And it shows the Northwest frontier having been formalised by the British into the Northwest frontier provinces, shown on the left. And to the east of that, and across the Indus River, which kind of forms the boundary is the Punjab, which is a very fertile agricultural region. And the map on the right shows Waziristan. It's an enlarged version of a little bit of the map on the left there, and it just shows the area we're talking about, which is Waziristan, which is the southernmost portion of the northwest frontier, and it encompasses around 5,000 square miles of essentially naffle. It's roughly 120 miles from north to south and 60 miles from east to west. At the north, the boundary is the Kuram Valley, and in the south, it's the River Gomal. Then the major Indian Army brigade-sized bases of Wana, Razmak, and Banu are circled in red on that one. And then moving on, this is from Google Maps, and it shows the terrain pretty much as it is. It's not Lincolnshire, or I suppose Nebraska for the Americans. It's very, very mountainous, and Razmak is in the middle there, circled in beige. So that's where we are. And John Masters in his book describes the frontier as a tilted wilderness of rock and scrub, hard, barren and jagged, split here and there by stony watercourses in which little water flowed. A typically good description from him of the harsh, tangled, arid, stony terrain. There are forests on the mountains of eastern Waziristan and scrub on the eastern hills, but for the most part, the countryside has a dry, rocky appearance, with only small areas of farming arable land, which sort of sit alongside the handful of rivers, most of which are aligned east to west. And the nature of the countryside is matched by the arid climate. Climate. What rainfall there is falls periodically in heavy showers that will turn the trickling watercourses into raging torrents, as the Norfolk Regiment are finding out there bottom right. The hot season runs between May and October, and it brings a wall of heat, which can bring life to the in the valleys and in the plains, maybe not quite to a hole, but certainly to a crawl. At Razmak, which is one of the main British bases, which is at an altitude of about 6,500 feet, which is 2,100 meters. The average temperature in summer at the time would have been 78.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 25.8 degrees Celsius. So Google tells me. In the winter, snow fell at altitude, and then the top right-hand corner there, we can see Razmak in winter. And this snow forced a migratory pattern onto the inhabitants, one of the main reasons being that there's a huge scarcity of wood fuel in the mountains. And alongside this harsh climate, malaria and smallpox were ever present. Next slide. And these are Pashtuns, called at the time Pathans, or by the British soldiers, Pathans. For consistency, I'm going to use the correct for the period term, Pathans. They are the inhabitants of most of the northwest frontier. Originally, they were invaders from Afghanistan, and DNA and what have you would prove that they originated in what is now Iran.
Right.
The three largest Pathan tribes in Waziristan in 1936 were, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, the Utmanzai Wazirs, the Ahmadzai Wazirs, and the Masuds. The disturbances in 1936 to 37 were mostly among the Wazirs, with the Masuds generally, but not always, holding aloof from large-scale involvement, but as always on the frontier, conducting the usual smaller raids and ambushes. There's also, excuse me, there's also the minority Dawa and Bhutani tribes who occupy the eastern part of Waziristan, but they have a minor involvement in the disturbances of the period, and in general they have better relations with the government in any case, as they're closer to the settled areas of British India, so there's more penetration and cross fertilization between the two. The overall population of Waziristan, according to the 1931 census, was 201,783, and of these, about 117,000 and a half were males.
Right.
Okay. So the inhabitants of Waziristan Firstly, they lived as sort of semi-nomadic people, often with summer and winter dwelling places, and living in extended family communities in clusters of semi-fortified dwellings, which we've got good examples of here on screen. These were surrounded by generally a few small fields, as we can see upper right there, which were often terraced into the hillsides. And although we're saying that these people lived in Waziristan, the tribes didn't really acknowledge the boundaries. So you might get parts of the tribe living in Afghanistan, parts of the tribe living in Waziristan, and parts of the tribe living in the settled areas of the Punjab.
I was going to ask you that, John, because you're talking about an era where a lot of the Western world has sorted out the globe, borders, governments, systems in place. But this is an era where some people do not kind of adhere to that kind of system that is outside of their culture. It's just the land, and unless the border has a fence on it. So I'm glad you kind of quantified that. And also, Jim Walsh asked you, do you have any understanding of what the word wazir means in terms of its linguistic origin? He says Google is contradicting itself.
That's a very good question. I hadn't even thought to look into it. To be honest, I just that's what they're called. So sorry, Jim.
Got some homework for you afterwards. No problem.
Okay, so yes, I'm glad you're absolutely spot on there, Paul. These people were fiercely independent. They acknowledged no outside government, and even among themselves, their headmen, who were called maliks, often had little to no coercive authority. They were more a loose federation of families and tribes. But when not united against outsiders, like the British, they, like the rest of the Pathans, were often riven by internal warfare and blood feuds. We have made this sound a bit anarchic, but the Pathans were bound by the code of, again butchered, Pashtunwali. And this code has pillars which are hospitality and protection of guests, eye for an eye justice, which explains the blood feuds, and protection of female relatives, possessions, and land, but not necessarily in that order. It also valued independence, courage, and forgiveness of a sort. And the blood feuds and the agricultural poverty led to a vicious cycle of endemic internal warfare and raiding. Not at a low level, but pretty much constant. And any money that they did gain would go on armament rather than societal improvements. Okay. Right, and we're talking about the border, and here it is, and formidable it looks. This is our little bit of history, which I'll try and rattle through as quickly as possible because it's definitely not World War II. The British had first encountered the Pathans along their lines of communication in the First Afghan War, 1839-42, but they came into regular contact with them following the Second Anglo-Sikh War of 1848-49. The British succeeded in this war, and it led to them annexing the Punjab. And then, obviously, with annexing the Punjab, this brought them up against the mountains that mark the border of Afghanistan. By and large, they sensibly stayed out of them, only venturing into them for butcher and bulk punitive raids. And these would tend to follow raids into the settled areas by the Pathan. But after the sort of Second Anglo-Afghan War, which is 1878 to 1881, so we're getting closer, the British decided to consider a more forward defensive posture. The war was triggered by British fears that Russia was looking to encroach into Afghanistan as a prelude to invading India. Obviously, Russia was an empire at the time and had been expanding southwards through Crimea and all the Khanates for decades. The British intended that Afghanistan would form the buffer state. And should the Russians make a move, the British wanted to fight them in Afghanistan rather than in India. And as a result, the British starting positions needed to be further forward than they were at the time. And that's when the British annexed a number of the border regions, after agreeing where the border should be with the Afghans, or roughly where it should be. And then this whole zone between the Afghan border and the Indus River, basically, is designated tribal territories. It's part of the British Empire, but it's essentially leaving the Pathans to their own devices. The British installed political agents inside the territory who would keep an eye on the tribes, hand out subsidies to the tribal leaders for good behaviour and job opportunities as a carrot, but they would call in the army as a big stick if raids across the Indus occurred, or even if internecine squabbling got out of hand. And I think someone was talking about carry on up the Khyber, and I think isn't Sid James the political agent or the resident in that film living
I can't believe we're using Carry On films as a historical reference, but I like the style of doing that. I think he probably was, There's to say that there are people kind of likening this in the sidebar to kind of the American West and some of the the indigenous peoples of America. That kind of part when the USA, the official part of the USA, was all in the East. Then it was just like the great sort of untamed West, and this is the similar thing there, where there's more structure elsewhere in that part of the world, but this bit is kind of no man's land, somewhere between no man's land and uncharted territory.
Absolutely, that's absolutely spot on. The politicals are very important. They're often viewed by the army as having gone native, and there's a much repeated but probably apocryphal story of a political agent saying that we fought well that day, and meaning the tribesmen. Overall, I think the army is a little bit unfair. You would expect the political wing of the government to try and have the best interests of the Pathans front and centre, and having a certain amount of identification with the communities they spent every day with, was both unavoidable and I think beneficial. The army fought the tribesmen as enemies. The political agent might look on them as more misguided fellow citizens.
Right.
They were closely overseen by district commissioners, and in Waziristan there was a resident, which is very, much like many of the Indian states that Mike Tickner was talking about. They'd install somebody to look after the place. It was a difficult and dangerous job, given only to very highly rated men who could come from either the army or from the civil service. They would need to be able to speak Pashto fluently and colloquially, be very quick thinking, patient, and absolutely committed to a Spartan lifestyle amongst a whole raft of qualities. There is a story about Major Barney Barnes, who was one of the political agents. He was in a Jirga on a bitterly cold day in November 1936, like a brass monkey day. And he was telling the Waziri headman off because their young men had been, raiding and causing trouble and what have you. And he was giving them a bit of a grilling, and they weren't happy. Perhaps mindful that, as we said, they didn't really have that much coercive authority. And they were saying things like, "Oh, well, you're the political agent. You should be sorting this out. What's wrong with you? And haven't you got any balls?" And Barnes, who was sat cross-legged, because you don't stand up when you're addressing a Jirga, because that's like real bad manners. He was sitting cross-legged in front of them, and he shoved his hands in his pockets, and he had a rummage around, and he said, "Well, I thought I had some balls, but it's that cold, I'm not sure anymore." And the whole Jirga just collapsed with laughter, and he was able to get his point across. And this is another thing with the Pathans, they do have a real sense of humour, a really dark one. There's another story that I absolutely love, which is on one of these border raids. The British were blowing up the towers of people who had been causing trouble as like a sort of punitive measure. And they'd blown up a few towers in this village, and the headman, who for some reason didn't know that his tower was on the list, but they asked him if he'd like to blow up the next one. And so he pressed the plunger, blew up his own tower, which came down. And apparently the look on his face was so funny that all the villagers that were stood around, instead of being angry, just howled and howled with laughter, and were literally rolling on the floor with laughter. So that's their kind of sense of humour, very dark, but one that the British actually quite appreciated at times. Right. So to help the political agents and to facilitate control, the government built a string of forts across the tribal territory. These were manned by lightly equipped units known as scouts, who did most of the day-to-day work, and they were under the direct control of the political agents of the relevant territory. So they weren't military per se, but they were political. As I said, they were lightly armed, they were very fast, shot straight, and they were respected by virtually everyone they came into contact with. They were recruited from amongst the Pathans, generally not the same people that they're in amongst, but perhaps slightly a few miles up the road, and that's where they'd come from. And they'd serve 3 or 4 years in the Scouts, unless they're promoted, and then they'd go back and live amongst the tribes again. They were the political agents' local muscle, and the visible presence of the government in the tribal areas. However, as I said, they were lightly equipped, and they lacked the ability to deal with heavy resistance. And if things boiled over into a full-scale frontier war, the army would come stomping in, and regular brigades would be drummed up from the bigger bases back in the Punjab. And the political agent lived in a scout base, but when he went out and about during times of peace, it would be with a tribal escort, not a military escort or a scout escort. Obviously to keep the hotheads down, and this was relying on the code of protection of guests that was being part of Pushton Wali. There's also the fact that if someone does take a pot shot at him, the RAF is liable to take a long, hard, and ultimately quite explosive look at their house. So there was a carrot and stick there as well. So that's the Scouts. And linking these bases were built roads. And interestingly, the road and a few hundred yards either side was government territory. And if a tribesman murdered somebody on that strip of land, that's a crime to be dealt with by the full weight of the government. If they murder someone outside that strip of land, it's a tribal matter. Obviously, if it happens too much, then the Scouts will get involved, and so on and so forth. So, as well as facilitating the military movement amongst the Pathans, much like Roman roads were built, the roads were considered as a civilizing influence. They were bringing trade and job opportunities, and they were a central plank of the whole pacification process. Okay. Well, I am rattling along quite quickly. If I am going too quickly, if I haven't explained anything well enough, do let me know. But hopefully, I think we're going.
You're doing really well. I like the fact you're explaining that it is. When we've talked about the pre-war era and the battalions of the British Army, it's that kind of overseas policing where it's not border defense in like the Maginot Line. It's policing that can only function if the situation around is fairly peaceful. As soon as anything was to brew up, clearly they're not equipped in terms of numbers or tech to deal with anything. So it's a sort of a delicate balance of policing in a sort of a discreet way, but at the same time making sure people see you're there. Difficult.
Sorry, Paul. There's also the Frontier Constabulary, which I've essentially glossed over in this presentation because I felt it just added an extra layer of complication. They're the police, and they police inside the settled areas, not inside the tribal areas.
Thank you.
What we have now, these are Cassadars, who are a sort of tribal police employed to keep the police at a lower level again than the Scouts. And they would act as an escort to the political agent when he went out and about. They are mildly useful in times of sort of peace, because if someone shot one, that would involve the shooter in a blood feud with their families and their part of the tribe. However, for the same reason, if a Cassadar shoots somebody, then they're involved in a blood feud, and they're pretty reluctant to shoot people if they don't really have to.
Right.
I think they would sort of see themselves more working for the tribe, helping carry out the government's policy, rather than as servants of the government. And if the tribe and the government were at loggerheads, then Cassadar neutrality was the best that could be hoped for. And we'll see later on where perhaps they slid over the line the other way. Right, so, okay. So a bit more history, but disturbances in Waziristan starting in 1917, and especially in the 1920s, sort of following the Third Afghan War of 1919, led to really fierce fighting, and there were heavy casualties among government troops. And as a result, a large base was built at Razmak, which is the one we're looking at here, and troop levels at the other bases we showed, Wana and Banu just outside the tribal area, and frankly, almost an oasis of civilization, or an oasis of almost civilization, where the troop levels there were increased. And these precautions generally kept a reasonable lid on the frontier from maybe 1925 onwards. However, through the 1930s, there are a number of local grievances, and these set against a backdrop of religious fanaticism, and the overall perception that the British resolve in India was weakening led to a number of serious outbreaks of violence, of which 1936 to 1937 is the most serious, and that's the way we're looking at that one today. So, this is a cracking photo on the left. Tribal society lacked any formal military organisation, as we Westerners would view it. When an external threat of sufficient calibre overrode any feuding divisions, the fighting strength of a tribe, or part of a tribe, would form a war band known as a lashkar. To do this, mullahs, or priests, would settle the internal disturbances and arrange truces between the feuding parties. And this would allow the tribe to decide on a plan of campaign, how many men each section would put up, where to rendezvous, and to choose a leader. Lashkar size varied widely, so it went from small groups up to several thousand men at times, generally dictated by the logistic capabilities of the surrounding area. We've already touched on how arid and bare the land was. And the Lashkar lacked a formal leadership structure. There's no organisation, no discipline as we view it again, and obviously no organised transport or supply capability. Command would normally devolve on one man, an individual with the charisma and influence to hold the fighting men together. But the nature of Pathan society being individualistic and egalitarian precludes him from wielding this influence for any length of time.
Right.
So tribesmen would turn up at their rendezvous armed with their own rifle, ammunition, blankets and food, and there'd also be unarmed men and boys who would carry food and ammunition, carry away the wounded, and would serve as reinforcements, taking weapons from the dead. And the Lashkar would be able to supply itself for about 10 or 12 days. Any more than that, and food, water, ammunition runs low and needs to be replenished. And that either has to be from home or, if possible, by forcible requisition from local villages. But that obviously has its own pitfalls, and you're back into blood feud territory again. If defeated, a Lashkar's cohesion would break down because the leaders would be discredited and lose authority. And if either of these things happen, i.e. they run out of ammo or they get beat, the Lashkar would disperse back to their homes and wait while the tribe would gather, hold jirga, and deliberate on the next step, what to do, whether to carry on fighting or whether to turn back into farmers. On an individual level, the pretty much constant feuding and the intertribal warfare had developed the fighting skills of the individual tribesmen to a fine pitch. Physically fit, adept at skirmishing, fieldcraft, and weapon handling. They were intimately.
I'm assuming, John, and correct me if I'm wrong, sort of based on a kind of hit and run kind of attitude.
Yes, I'll get to that in just a second, Paul. You're absolutely right. But they're all intimately acquainted with their area of operations, including routes and resources. They were skilled at and equipped to utilise the hillsides for cover and concealment. Now, as Paul has just rightly pointed out, Lashkars would attempt to hold defensive positions on important ridges or passes on probable lines of advance. They fortified them with stone sangers, and these were often, in an L shape, so you get frontal and flanking fire. But each man fought as an individual. He advanced or retired as he saw fit. Rarely stayed for hand-to-hand defensive fighting, for slip away, particularly if threatened on a flank, and especially if you get round behind them. They excel at hit-and-run guerrilla warfare, attacking isolated detachments like the forage parties, good at raiding lines of communication, and particularly good at following up rear guards as they head into camp. These latter were often the fiercest of engagements. If they spotted an opportunity, the tribesmen were happy to get in close because they were always seeking rifles and ammunition.
Right.
So a single mistake, moving a picket too early, sighting a covering machine gun in the wrong place, tribesmen will spot this, and their speed and mobility across difficult terrain. Apparently, this had to be seen to be believed. And it actually says that in so many words in the Frontier Manual, that it has to be seen to be believed. Allows them to get in close, fire a volley, and then get in for hand-to-hand combat, finishing off the wounded and taking away the rifles and the ammunition. But even in this period, there were occasionally full-scale attacks on columns, convoys, and even camps, and these were attempted with varying degrees of success. I just pause there for a.
And I like the fact you're on the beer already. I'm waiting till later on, but
it's Friday night. It's been beer o'clock for a couple of hours already.
No judgment from me, sir.
Good man. So sorry, I've jumped a slide. I do apologise. Right. So I think, again, these pictures show Cassadars obviously getting in close to taking up a photograph of an armed tribesman that wants to shoot you quite hard. So I think these are probably the almost good guys. And the only distinguishing feature of a Cassadar is an armband, which I think you can see on the guy on the left just, and on a couple of the guys in the right. But looking at the guy on the left, and this picture comes up in album after album that I've got. So it's obviously a good picture and representative of what the soldiers are finding themselves up against. So he's wearing chapleys, which are sandals, and these give him agility and mobility across sort of screwy slopes. His baggy trousers and his flowing shirt are grey or khaki, and they offer good concealment against the backdrop of the rocky terrain. Lightly equipped, he's armed with an accurate and reliable short magazine Lee Enfield of 303 caliber, but I don't think I need to tell anyone that. He is as hard as nails. And to give an example of how hard these guys are, when they wipe their bum, they use a handful of gravel. Oh. Yeah, I know. It's terrifying. He looks all very little.
And see, that's the kind of detail you only get on World War II TV.
Exactly.
We famously did the breakdown of STIs by the South African Armored Division, regiment by regiment, a couple of years ago. But toilet hygiene using gravel is a first.
That's splendid.
Thank you for that, John. That's
yeah. And he's got a few cartridges, a knife, and a little food along with that rifle. And the Lee Enfield is the most common tribal weapon, but you do still find older weapons like the Lee Metford or even the Martini Henry. But the Martini Henry is usually being rechambered to 303 by this period.
Of course, yeah.
However, this comes up in a couple of the accounts. The Jezzail, which is a very long-barreled flint or even sometimes matchlock muzzle loader, was reported as being heard in operation during these operations.
I mean, again, I'm going down a tangent, but I got a friend, Carl Hatzinger, who was in the 101st Airborne. When he was in Afghanistan X number of years ago, because he was historian, he kept a log of the different weapons they found in Afghanistan this century. And it was extraordinary how far back. I mean, he never knew exactly how often these weapons were used. He would find them in these hidden caches in caves and stuff. But obviously, all your kind of your modern stuff, M16s and KK-47s, but lots of World War II stuff. He found Metfords and Russian stuff from the 19th century, even 15 years ago. So clearly, that area, that part of the world, has had a sort of recycling of older tech as part of its culture for basically since guns were around.
If you go to Rawalpindi, even now, I expect that if you know the right people, you would be able to pick yourself up a Lee Enfield or 15 if you wanted. Yeah. So rifles, but heavy weapons, few and far between. Occasionally encounter a Lewis gun, but the ammunition expenditure is problematic for tribes. And in this period, very, very occasionally, they used a captured mountain gun. But the results are really disappointing. You see, anything like a Lewis gun or a mountain gun, is worth fighting to defend, but it's hard to get away. And this costs the tribe their mobility, and staying to defend them is exactly what the government is after. They want the tribesmen to stand and fight so they can bring their vastly superior firepower to bear. And tactically, the tribesmen were quite astute. Plenty of them had served in the Indian Army or the Scouts for a spell. And although they're the high point of tactical excellence for both the Waziris and the Masuds is 1917 to 925, in this period there are large amounts of ex-Indian Army soldiers in their ranks. And in the fighting of that period, Indian Army battalions took heavy casualties, in the hundreds on occasion. Right, so that's the tribes. Move on to the government forces. Mike Tickner did a really good job of covering the selection of officers for the Indian and British armies and the whole martial races theory. So thank God I don't need to go over that again. On the left we have British infantry, and there are Gurkhas behind them. They're actually both dressed and equipped in the same fashion aside from headgear. The Gurkhas, in fact, they wear two hats. Just sewn one inside the other as a protection from the sun, whereas the British wear the Wolseley helmet or the solar topi. And other than that, they've got boots, socks, puttees, khaki shorts, and as it's winter, obviously in the left-hand picture, they've got grey back shirt and pullover. In the summer, it's khaki drill. The rifle, of course, is the SMLE, perhaps 150 rounds per soldier, with more on the ammunition mules. And the regulars, but not the Scouts, would also have either a section Lewis gun or a Vickers Berthier, which is not a weapon we perhaps know much about. But if you look at it from anything more than a few feet away, it looks exactly like a Bren gun. And in fact, it competed against the Bren gun for adoption in the British Army in the mid 30s. But the British chose the Bren, but they gave the Indian Army the Vickers Berthier, and the Indian Army doesn't get the Bren mostly until about 1942. Right. Okay. And on the right is the officer class. And these are officers of a British battalion. I think this was slightly earlier in the 30s, but it's the best picture I had. And they've got the Webley, either .38 or .45 if they've got any sense, and that vital stick for pointing at things, which is an essential piece of kit. And as Blackadder made it clear, you wouldn't want to face a machine gun without one.
Indeed.
Yeah. Indian units made up the vast majority of the units involved in the frontier campaigns. The order of battle for Waziristan in 1936-37, going from the official history, lists some 302 army units or sub-units and 15 Royal Air Force units. The majority of the army units are support units in headquarters sections, and clear, for example, the Dasari Dairy Farm and number 8 petrol oil lubricant section, all very useful. But if we look at the teeth units involved, there were 6 British infantry battalions, 36 Indian infantry battalions, 6 Royal Armoured Corps light tank companies, and both tank and armoured car units come under the heading of light tank, 6 Royal Artillery field batteries, and 2 light batteries, along with 11 Indian mountain batteries. Now, not all of these units were operating at the same time, but at the height of the army response, there were 7 brigades operating in the Waziristan area at the same time. Right, and then pop it on. Okay. And as Mike Tickner indicated, each infantry brigade usually had a mixture, of British, Indian, and Gurkha troops, generally with 1 British infantry battalion and 3 or sometimes 4 Indian and Gurkha infantry battalions, and then all the supporting troops. So if we look at, for example, the brigade column from Razmak, and Razmak's columns are always known as Razkol. This is the one that went into the Kasora Valley in November 1936. At the start of the operations, it consisted of Brigade HQ, Brigade Signal Section, number 22 Mountain Artillery Brigade HQ, and 3 mountain batteries. There's the 1st Battalion of Northamptonshires, 5th Battalion of 12th Frontier Force Rifles, and the 6th Battalion of the 13th Frontier Force Rifles, and both of those are the Indian battalions, and the 1st Battalion of the 9th Gurkha Rifles. The 7th Field Ambulance, and there were 3 and a bit animal transport companies with mules, which was the main form of transport away from the roads. There's a veterinary detachment and a detachment from the supply issue section, who must have been livid. I have seen brigades occasionally operating, for example, on lines of communication where there were only Indian and Gurkha battalions and no British battalion. Okay. And aside from Raskol, there would have been a couple of battalions left behind in Razmak to defend the base. And overall, Razmak, for example, houses approximately 10,000 men and no women whatsoever at any time. There were no women at Razmak. The few British wives or dependents would be at Banu, where there was a club and a swimming pool, and not so many angry Pathans. And the Indian soldiers left their families back at the regimental depot whilst they went on tour to the frontier. Okay.
Just a quick question before you move on.
Yeah, sure.
What's that white checkered flag in the top left photo there? Is it some kind of range stick kind of flag?
It's a marker. So I think in this case, it's to mark where so in a camp, each battalion or battery has its section that it needs to look after both the perimeter, and that's where it camps out. And I think that marks probably the edge of what I think are the Norfolks again. I think that marks the edge of the Norfolks of the camp.
And then another one about the photos themselves. Ian Carr, are these photos originally glass plate?
Good question, Ian. I don't. Some possibly are, but I think the majority aren't. So there are two types of photo in this presentation. There are ones taken by professional Indian photographers who accompany the troops into the field, and they're based at Rawalpindi, but they also had a sub depot at Razmak, and they would take photographs and then sell the prints of them to British soldiers and officers, and potentially Indian soldiers as well, for years to come. So they take pictures of notable features of the camp and sell those for years to come. But they'd also take photos of the battalion when it marched into camp and when it was out on manoeuvres, and they'd sell those photos to the soldiers of the battalion concerned. The other kind of photo is the one from probably the Box Brownie camera, which is carried by a lot of soldiers at the time. And I think if we look at these, actually, I'm not sure this is the best. I'm pretty confident that bottom right is definitely an Indian photograph, but I think the other three are all soldier taken photos. We'll have a look at a set of photos in a different slide where you can clearly see the difference. But how the Indians took the photograph, I don't know. There's no photographs of their cameras.
Right. Yes.
So they might be glass slide, but the British ones are definitely Kodak.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. That's a fabulous photograph. It really is. And it's uncaptioned, but I'm 95% sure it shows a section of the Tochi Scouts. And again, they wear chapleys rather than boots, native trousers, native shirts. And there's an officer seated on the right, who you might not have spotted. He's a British officer, and he wears the same kit. And then on the very right-hand side, is an Indian officer. Now, in an Indian battalion, he'd be a Viceroy's commissioned officer or VCO, and I might tick the covered this. But because he's a member of the Scouts, his commission comes from the governor of the Northwest Frontier. So, although his role remains the same, he's not a VCO by definition. And they've got a pet fox, which is brilliant.
Yeah, no, that's why I chose that photo for the graphic for YouTube, because it's just a great one. It just seemed to. It had the terrain in the background. It had what I wanted in it, and the photos just made it.
That one, yeah. Right. So, Vickers gun. You all know what the Vickers is. Reliable. Part of the equipment for both British and Indian regular battalions. And Indian battalions had, although they had 4 companies like the British battalions, the 4th company was a machine gun company, so they only had 3 rifle companies. Scouts didn't have any of these except for a handful based on their forts for point defence. The Vickers is heavy and requires extra mule transport, but it provides a valuable means of support in the hills, away from the roads. And this is that you can see here, where there's 3 photos have a white marking in the corner. those are Indian photographers' markings, and those 3 are definitely Indian photographs. And this one in the right-hand corner, from the album it came from, I know that's a soldier taken one, and that's the difference between them. If they've got that little mark inside, they're definitely Indian taken photos. Right. And the other support that you would get in the hills is the artillery. On bottom right corner, the smaller weapon, that's the 3.7-inch mountain howitzer, which equips all the mountain batteries and the light batteries of the Royal Artillery. It breaks down to a number of mule transportable sections, which can be seen top right, and thus it can accompany the troops in the hills. From being on a mule to being in action, the mountain gunners take about 90 seconds. That quick. Okay. Excellent, robust weapon, useful size HE shell, and a howitzer because you need to get it up and down over the steep ridges.
Yeah,
that's why it's howitzer.
I can definitely see, to interrupt you, the correlation between this and World War II, because you get to Italy in 44, 45, and you get that whole having to drag artillery pieces up mountains. Of course, there are Indian troops in Italy, so I can definitely see a sort of if you happen to be an Indian officer or NCO, they say, well, we're back in 37 up in the Northwest Frontier. This is how we did it. I mean,
we've done it. Yeah.
Yeah. And not that it would have necessarily applied here, but the kind of the Aussies were doing in New Guinea, that, you can get, if you can get artillery somewhere, you can bring it, especially in mountainous areas. I'm sure even the Vickers machine guns were used for indirect fire as much as direct fire in that environment with that kind of, the terrain there. It's about just bringing down fire support, isn't it? Fantastic. I'm really enjoying this one.
Okay, good. Because I realise that I'm talking quite a lot, and we're getting on a little bit for time, so I apologise, but we'll get through it. The Royal Artillery, as opposed to Indian, also provided heavier firepower, 18 pounder and 4.5-inch guns, and a 6-inch howitzer. I think that top left is a 6-inch howitzer. I'm not great with artillery, but I think that's
someone in the sidebar said it was. So yes.
Okay, great. Yay. The heavier batteries are motorised by this point, and they can't venture into the hills. Forward observation is provided by radio and mule-mounted radio, as shown bottom left. It's also possible it was done by telephone, but I've been unable to find this out for sure. I've got an album that belonged to somebody in one of the light batteries, and it shows very obviously radio-equipped HQs, and there's definitely heliographs as well set up in the background to provide an extra means of communication as well. So another wonder of the modern age is the Vickers Crossley armoured car, used for base defence and convoy escort, generally restricted to the roads, and could be fitted with wireless. We'll see that how the armoured cars do excellent work at this one. Photograph bottom right, it actually shows an Indian crewed car, which suggests it's 1939 or 1940, because the Royal Armoured Corps disbands its own armoured car companies in 39, and they don't take part in World War II. And then zip it on. And along with the Crossleys, the Royal Armoured Corps also employed 2 companies of light tanks, and these are Mark II or Mark IIB, which is the Indian pattern, and it's the one. It differs from the Mark II, and it's got an extra cupola on the top. I don't know why. Ventilation, I think. For that. If you're really eagle-eyed, you'll notice there's a Mark IV in the photo top right, which means that's like 38 or 39. The Mark IV takes, I think, does Mark IV or Mark VI take part in France in 1940? I think.
I think it does. Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
Good light tanks. And tanks have proved extremely valuable. They have got a good cross-country ability, and they're invulnerable to small arms fire. And the Pathans don't have an anti-tank capability. So the tanks are often used as a rear guard or an advance guard for columns, or providing reconnaissance in areas where parties on foot would be shot up. Tanks are very new to the frontier. The first deployment of tanks on the frontier was 1935, so still plenty of teething issues to be worked out. some of which can be seen here. And the tanks are limited by terrain, and the terrain is an absolutely limiting factor in all of this. It restricts or prevents mobility of horse as well as mechanised troops, and it slows the infantry down, reduces their movement options. They can only go a certain number of ways, which gives excellent opportunities for ambush and escape on the part of the Pathans. So we're talking about mountain warfare, which is a specialised part of light infantry tactics, and it's what we term today, as I've written this down, asymmetric warfare in a counterinsurgency sphere. The infantry will spearhead most of the time, and light infantry doctrine, make sure you're covered by supporting weapons, keep in touch on your flanks, move in bounds, make use of cover, and on the frontier especially, never, ever, ever drop your guard.
Yeah.
Okay. And normally there were 6 squadrons of the Royal Air Force based near the frontier, equipped with Westland Wappities on the right, Hawker Harts on the left. And the Air Force and the Indian Army on the frontier have developed excellent close cooperation by this point. And the Army conducted reconnaissance, liaison, and close support. Communication was with the ground, just changing to wireless telephony, but First World War methods still remained in use. Because the ground troops engaged might not have access to wireless. So you can have panels laid out on the ground. Aircraft could pick up messages using a hook, which you can see top right. And they could drop hand-written messages on the ground. And air-to-air communication was by hand-signalled Morse code. So it's known as zogging. And essentially you do a short movement of the arm to indicate a dot and a long movement to indicate a dash. Air power was usually used in a blockading role, so recalcitrant villages would be leafleted saying no people or animals in this area between these dates, and the RAF would turn up and enforce that. The disruption to daily life and the prevention of food production and all the bits and pieces like that was intended to force the tribe to back down. Now, punitive bombing, even at the time a controversial subject, and it was supposed to be strictly limited, with only known dissidents' buildings being targeted, and only then in areas previously marked as prescribed, so civilians shouldn't be in there, and they were heavily leafleted with warnings of the impending bombing. And this is a cardinal rule that applied even with troops in contact. However, it is possible that villages were attacked without these precautions being taken, and perhaps more indiscriminately than the official history suggests. This is a difficult one because the memoirs of the time and the official handbooks are absolutely adamant that it never happened. It did not happen. You had to go to the government of India to bomb a village. But the chief of the air staff at the time was Geoffrey Salmon, and his papers allegedly describe that this was happening. And this comes from a book called Wings of Empire by Colin Renfrew. So I've only read the book. I haven't looked at the sources. I don't know is the answer, whether it did happen or it didn't happen. Okay. Flying on the northwest frontier was dangerous. Mountainous terrain, forced landings generally out. The weather could be difficult. The air is turbulent. And the low altitudes and slow speeds of the aircraft. So the Wapiti 140 miles an hour, the Hart a heady 170 miles an hour, meant they were vulnerable to small arms fire. And small arms fire was potentially effective up to 2,500 feet. The Pathans were used to aircraft. They'd been used on the frontier since 1916, and they knew about leading them, and they occasionally shot one down. And for the aircrew, coming down in enemy territory could be awkward, very difficult. The natives were very unfriendly, unsurprisingly, and it's here that the infamous Goonie Chit originated, which promised substantial rewards should aircrew be returned fully intact from the waist downwards, shall we say?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And there are some absolutely brilliant pilot autobiographies from the period. Well worth a read. David Lee, Tony Dudgeon, Jeff Morley-Mower, who wrote Messerschmitt Roulette as well. So he was in the Western Desert with a TAC R Hurricane Squadron being chased around by Hans-Jürgen in Marseille, which probably less fun, even less fun than the possibility of losing your bits. So that's the scene set. We'll have a quick rummage through the campaign. And this is a heavily abbreviated timeline showing the broad phases of activity. And all the while that these broad headlines are going on, there's other stuff going on. The RAF are doing their bits, the Pathans are raiding, ambushing and sniping, and the politicals are talking and trying to get them to calm down. So although it says this is happening, there's an awful lot going on. There are hundreds of incidents during this period, and this presentation's already going to be slightly longer than I
don't care. It's Friday night, whatever. Who cares?
That's fine. But if we went for everything, it would be about 6 hours long. So, there we are. So look at the top there. The Islam Bibi case is a Romeo and Juliet tale of teenage, underage love and elopement, cleverly exploited by a local agitator named Mir Ali, who the British called the Faqir of Ipi. And this case set against what we said earlier, the backdrop of widespread Indian nationalism and British concessions, created the conditions that brought the uprising into being. And the initial spark was an ill-conceived and poorly executed show the flag operation at the end of November 1936 in the Kaisora Valley. Now, Mir Ali was a driving force behind the insurrection. He was never brought to book, always able to slip across the border when things got too hot. But he was really well respected amongst the tribes. He was a very holy man. He was a Haji. He'd been on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he had excellent sources. There were many Pathan eyes around the camps and bases, and they generally knew what was going on. Surprise was very hard to get on the frontier. And on one occasion, he walked up at a village, said, "The British are coming to bomb you. I will protect you." And the British aircraft duly turned up, and he said, "I will turn their bombs to paper." And the British aircraft leafleted the village, and he went, "I have turned their bombs to paper, but they will be back again, and I am too weak now to defend against them. Give me lots of money and food, and we will protect you from them." And obviously the British had just been intended to leaflet them anyway, but he'd known this, and he told the villagers that he'd turned the bombs to paper.
It's interesting that, like waiting for buses after 1900 shows into World War II TV, and we're mentioning the Faqir of Ipi today, but we mentioned him last Friday as well on the show with Mihir Bose about Silver, the spy in World War II. So we've mentioned him twice in 7 days, which is interesting.
So obviously he was very Islamic, and he was keen on protecting Islam, and he was a prime mover for what he wanted was the eventual establishment of an independent Pathan state. There was probably some self-promotion involved, but the precise weight of his motives is impossible to ascertain at this distance. And he could certainly continue his activities long after the British left. He was interviewed in 1959 by an American reporter, but it wasn't a terribly informative interview. As reading the transcript, I don't think he asked the right questions, to be honest. Credit for turning up, but anyway. So after a bit of a lull following the punishment of the Tory Kell section of the Wazirs, following the November incident, the hardest period for the government is a period between February and April 1937. This is when the revolt spread. And the tribal Lashkars had all the initiative. So I want to look at two actions from this period in a little more detail, because they are very illustrative of the nature of tribal operations and the advantages and disadvantages that they operated under. However, in the meantime, between February and April, some of the activities involved ambush of traffic, and that's a government car, top left. It's got the British broad arrow. Destruction of roads, destruction of bridges, and destruction of telegraph wires. But to look at the first of the sort of interesting operations, it's the 29th of March 1937, and again we're back in the Kaisora Valley. A Lashkar of between 700 and 1,000 men, almost entirely from the Waziri tribes, ambushed the advance guard of the 1st Battalion of the 6th Gurkha Regiment, whilst they were clearing some low hills alongside the main road, whilst on road protection duty. This is the map from the official history. The advance guard is circled on the red, circled in red, and the main body is circled in blue. And that translates into this terrain here. Waziristan is mostly unchanged from 1937, and you can walk the ground pretty well using Google Maps, which is what I've done here. And this was a clever ambush. The Gurkhas were engaged by rifle fire from across the river to the south, and the main body was also engaged to prevent them from interfering. And then if we look here, this is a close-up of where I think the advance guard, looking at the map, where the advance guard have got to, and the yellow arrow indicates where the rifle fire is coming from. And according to Geoffrey Morris of the 1st Northamptons, the Gurkhas pivoted to face a threat, and they occupied positions behind a low wall on the north side of the road, which you can see there. But this was a feint, and over the ridge behind them came the main assault. And the tribesmen got in amongst the Gurkhas, and a fair struggle ensued. Hand-to-hand fighting, but here in the firing, armoured cars from the nearby Dosali Scout base, which is 3 miles up the road to the right as you look at that picture, arrived really quickly. And upon rounding the final bend, they surprised tribesmen fighting with the Gurkhas on the road, hand-to-hand, kukri to kaiba knife. And the armoured cars' machine guns drove the tribesmen into the nearby ravines. Severe fighting followed, and the 2nd Battalion, the 5th Gurkhas, and the South Wales Borderers tried a really complicated turning manoeuvre through the hills to the north. And they partially completed it, and they managed to pin the tribesmen into the ravines north of the road, and the tribesmen got hammered by machine guns, artillery, and aircraft. And only the arrival of night enabled the tribesmen to slip away. The government suffered 34 killed and 44 wounded, mostly from the 1st to the 6th, and I think these poor guys are from the 1st to the 6th. But the tribal forces suffered 94 killed and 64 severely wounded. Now, this was obviously planned. The tribes had clearly been watching the road protection force for a number of days, and they spotted something they thought they could exploit. Sweeping the same bit of road over and over reduces your ability to do things differently, and doing things differently is what stops you from being ambushed. If they don't know where you're going to be at a particular point, or there might be a company there or a platoon there, or there might be a tank there, and you just don't know, they won't hit you. But because they were doing the same thing, and I think as well, they were trying to clear the road a bit too quickly, possibly because nothing had happened, and as a result, they'd become a bit strung out, and the advance guard was getting too far ahead of the main body. And I think this is what the Pathans have spotted. But this is all just conjecture, because I think it's not surprising, but unlike other incidents in this campaign, there's no follow-up article in the Journal of the United Services Institute, and there's no report cited in any of the secondary source books, whereas there are for other bits of the operation. So I think that they've kept a discreet silence on what happened, but that's what I think happened. But on the other hand, I also think the Pathans got caught out. I think that the speed of reaction of the armoured cars from Dosali caught them out. I think that's the first thing. But I also think maybe that the firepower of the artillery came as a bit of a surprise. 6-inch howitzers hadn't been used on the frontier before, and I think they'd underestimated how hard the government forces could hit them. And I think that's what happened.
Terry Down made a really interesting point. Same with the French in convoy battles in Indochina. They had to vary their tactics and routine constantly. You can't be predictable. So
absolutely.
We've had echoes to kind of Native American wars. There's echoes going backwards and forwards in the British Army's wars. But there's, as with all periods of history, there's always these little connecting dots that sort of remind certain things, remind you of other things. And the other thing I wanted to ask before you move on, if you don't mind, is obviously the I'll call them the rebels, are just trying to drive people out of where they are, and that they're ultimately sort of this ideas of independence. But for the government forces, what's their end game? Do they want to eliminate the leadership of the enemy? Are they wanting to kind of crash the morale and hope everyone just kind of puts their weapons back in the cupboard and go back home? Or are they trying to eliminate everybody who poses a threat? Or are they kind of making up as they go along?
It's quite a complicated answer. So firstly, whilst Mir Ali may have wanted an independent state, I don't think that a lot of the tribesmen fought that way.
Right, okay.
I think what they were mostly fighting for was loot and rifles and ammunition. We've already touched on how hard life was in the mountains, and raiding the plains had been part of their modus operandi for centuries. And I think that they were quite happy that the government came into their area, provided that they let themselves be ambushed occasionally, and that they could take their weapons or what have you. The government forces, well, we've already touched on the dichotomy between the military and the political here. I'm sure the military would have been quite happy in some cases to kill everybody, or kill lots of people, but it was never a practical proposition. These are British subjects. So the idea was to get things to quieten down and then pacify them, or by putting roads and giving jobs and building hospitals and schools and all the things that they tried in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. I think those were the two. That's what they're trying to achieve. But to do that, the government's got to inflict a crushing defeat on the rebels. And we'll see how that's done in a couple of shortly, I hope. Okay, shortly-ish, Paul. Right. So the next little incident I want to talk about is the ambush in the Shahir Tangi, which is this here, and it's a convoy ambush, and you can see a convoy on that road, and you can see from this photograph just quite how ambushable it is, and on the 9th of April, 1937, a convoy consisting of 49 lorries and 2 private cars, escorted by 4 armoured cars, was ambushed by Massoud tribesmen. And we said earlier that the Massouds didn't take much part. This is their one major ambush, a guy called Konya Kell. It really does highlight the vulnerability of motor transport in these kind of regions. I've walked the ground using Google Maps, and I think the ambush point was the far end of the roads we could start, where the road disappears around the corner in the far distance. But the roads moved due to landslips and what have you on Google Maps, so I'm guessing. But the tribesmen opened fire from very carefully prepared positions, some of which was close as 15 yards to the road, but the majority of them were high up on the side of the road, which you can see on the right there. Out of the arc could be covered by the machine guns in the turrets of the armoured cars. Very cleverly placed. The opening volley disabled a number of the lorries, killed a number of drivers, and killed most of the escorting infantry before they could even get out of the lorry. One armoured car and 3 lorries broke through the ambush, but the tribesmen kept the remaining survivors pinned down for nearly 24 hours before they were able to get relief through. And even then, it was with great difficulty that the road was reopened. I mean, you can see how narrow that road is. If you want to turn around, it's going to be the kind of 176-point turn you see in a Tesco car park by a Nissan Micra occasionally. You know what I mean? It's just one of them really difficult to turn around in there. But again, the armoured cars save the day. They can't manoeuvre, but they ought to act as invulnerable strong points. And clumps of survivors fall around them, and they keep the tribesmen from overrunning them, except for in one place where they do get down to the road and they kill all the wounded. And the convoy suffers 46 killed and 45 wounded. And normally it's 3 to 1. So you know that a lot of the wounded were killed in that one. Tribal casualties were only 16 killed and 26 wounded, seriously wounded. And it appears that the initial ambush was conducted by only 80 men, but this had swelled to 300 as time went on because news had spread. And the reason that all these people are turning up is not just to shoot at people, because obviously that is fun, but they're looking for rifles and ammunition and anything else they can loot from the lorries if they do overrun the convoy. So again, predictability. The convoy was running at the same time each day, which you can't do. And interestingly, the defile, the valley here, it wasn't picketed. The government forces were overstretched, and the Cassadars didn't turn up on the day. And whether that's through coercion or sympathy with the insurgents, we don't know. But as we said, neutrality was the best you could hope for, and it didn't quite show up on today. And then following this ambush, you get 10 days of heavy tribal activity. A scout post is invested, an army of reconnaissance is held up, police station attacked, and a watering party from the Alexandra picket, which is a picket that overlooks Razmak. So it's about 8,000 feet up, was ambushed. And that's, again, quite an interesting little story, but we haven't got time to go into that one there. And at this point, there are approximately 2,150 tribesmen active in Lashkars in Waziristan. Okay. So after that period of tribal activity, the military take control. So the Waziristan is now under martial law, isn't quite the phrase, but the military in charge, and General Sir John Coleridge, who's the General Officer commanding Northern Command, which is where the Northwest Frontier provinces fall. I mean, there's other provinces as well, but he takes overall command from the resident. And the bulk of government operations now are offensive and mostly at brigade size. And the main feature, the remainder of the campaign, is marching columns looking to bring Lashkars to battle. And again, we've got the Norfolks getting their feet wet. But road building was also carried out as part of this operational landscape, because it's all about penetration and pacification and reach and being able to get into areas where you couldn't normally reach. And this map, which is probably a bit small on some people's screens, so I apologise, but this shows that the major road system in Waziristan, and you can see that quite a lot of it is there aren't any roads. The really dark roads are the ones that existed beforehand, and then just in the middle there's a bunch of slightly less defined dark roads, and those are all the roads that were built during the operation, and that shows you where the majority of this campaign took place. And if anyone wants to pause the video and zoom in, we'll see some of the names that I mentioned, like Razmak, and the Kaisora Valley, and Bishkashkai, and then down the middle there's Chaglai and another place, and that's the two places between which the Shahid Tangi runs. So it's all taking place in this little circle in the middle of that map there. Okay, so 37. So as I said, much of Waziristan is not yet on the road network, and when you're operating in the areas away from the roads, the column needs to march along the bottom of the valleys or along dried or trickling riverbeds, because it's got all the mules and all transport to drag along with it. And if you're going to move along the valley floor, you've got to crown the heights along the route to prevent being fired upon. And so as the column moves along, parties from the advance guard sent up left and right to picket tactically important points on the heights. And then as the column moves forward, the troops withdraw down, and then they leapfrog each other section by section, all while covered by artillery and machine guns. If the column's under pressure, and this is generally when it's withdrawing or when it's heading into camp for the night, then picket withdrawal is the prime time for an attack. And as we touched on earlier, if you get the timing wrong or the covering positions wrong, then the tribesmen get in amongst you. Picketing is really, really hard. The withdrawal part of it takes great professionalism. And it's notable that both Geoffrey Moore of the Northamptons and John Masters make particular note of occasions when senior officers comment on how well their picketing procedures are, how good they are at it, and it's a matter of great pride. But conversely, there's a battalion of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders whose skills were definitely not up to scratch. And on no less than 3 occasions, their pickets were attacked and ambushed, and a number of the Highlanders were killed. In one of these cases, their bodies were only brought in earlier, and at least one body had been mutilated. The top of the head had been cut off, and the brains removed, and stones and mud had been jammed inside the skull.
Yeah.
So, it's just a pretty generic photo, but with the need for picketing, columns move slowly. So it's about 8 to 12 miles a day, depending on resistance, being the absolute maximum. And because they're so slow, they require overnight camps to penetrate any distance into tribal territory. And these camps could be occupied for a number of days as columns went out left, right, and whatever, depending on the strategic position. Camps were always fortified, but rarely attacked due to the number of, due to the size and the number of automatic weapons that a column could field. And if you look at this camp here, this camp's been there for a number of days, but you can see that they've put a stone wall around it, and obviously you can roughly see the sort of gaps between each battalion. That each battalion's got its own separate portion of the camp to defend. There was an exception to this, and that's British Kashkai, where at the start of the main government operations, a number of pickets were attacked, and using a graveyard for cover, a group of tribesmen attempted to rush the perimeter gate, but were easily repelled. And using Google Maps, I managed to find where British Kashkai was and follow the attack and what have you. Camps were nearly always sniped, however, and troops would dig sleeping positions, dig down to have their sleeping positions. And the pickets encircling the camp, like this one here, are constructed out of stones prized from the ground and then wired in to prevent them being rushed. But to keep the snipers at arm's length, the pickets occupy high points overlooking the camp. But all this fortification, all this picketing needs time. And again, it's slowing down the rate of advance. And there were steps taken to counter this. Columns became adept at night operations, and there were continued efforts to reduce the size and slim down the number of transport animals, including resupply from the air, which is something that 14th Army made particular good use of later on.
I'm thinking, John, of that kind of dilemma of warfare is that the more effort you spend putting defenses around places where you want to stay, you're pushing the enemy to not attack you in those places and do something else. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't defend your bases, the enemy will attack you. But if you do defend them, then they'll just think about attacking somewhere else. And I'm also thinking as well that all of us watching this are seeing all these parallels. You know, the road watching, we're thinking of LRDG in North Africa. We're thinking of the kind of conditions that allies would face in Tunisia or Burma or whatever it would be. And yet in the same period, the late 1930s, when obviously Hitler is, rising up and doing all his crappy stuff, people are thinking more on the lines of a traditional kind of First World War, large-scale Western Front campaign. So I'm kind of thinking that all that an obvious spotlight on this campaign that we can see probably wouldn't have been seen back then, because it's a type of warfare they couldn't necessarily think was going to go towards. Does that make any sense to you, my rambling statement?
What is interesting is that as a result of one of the operations later on, there comes a school of thought which said, we shouldn't be doing this. It's too slow, we're too clumsy, we're too cumbersome, there is a better way, and we should use the tanks more, and we should use air. Perhaps we should use air support more, and perhaps we should move at night more, and perhaps we should do this and do that. So it's a constant learning curve. But I'm actually quite excited by this picture because it's a famous incident. It's a picket at Damdale Camp, and according to a caption in one of my albums, this is a picket that was attacked at night, and it's a well-known incident. By 50 Waziris who killed the sentry and the signaller, cutting the picket off from the camp, and attacked the 6 remaining Gurkhas there. And the 6 remaining Gurkhas fought them off all night. Hand grenades, rifles, kukris, stones, boots, fists, headbutts. An awesome effort before the Waziris withdrew. Every one of the survivors was wounded, but it's one of the Gurkha legends. It's one of the incidents that
it's a big diorama in the Gurkha Museum. I'm pretty certain, isn't it? I think it's a big section there. I was there a couple of years ago. Pretty certain that's there.
So I have to go, but yeah, absolutely. I would hope so. Yeah. So with extra troops now in Waziristan, the government's got the initiative again, and the larger Lashkars are dispersed by the end of June 1937. And this was achieved by half a dozen major operations of at least 2 brigades and occasionally of divisional size. So they're not small operations at all. So we talked about the attack on Bish Kashkai camp, but because the tribesmen had gathered to attack the camp, they're in range. And the column operates out of Bish Kashkai camp and catches hold of them and gives them a bit of a kicking. Well, this is exactly what these operations are intended to do. And I'll be honest, the operations that are carried out between April and June show, I think, and I am not, a tactical expert, but I think they show considerable tactical skill, successful feints, hammer and anvil type manoeuvres, and as I said, because the size of the force now, they're able to throw cordons wide enough to prevent the tribesmen from escaping. And the divisional sized force is particularly well handled by a chap called Major General Sir Alan Hartley, who goes on to become the Commander-in-Chief in India in 1943. And I think that it's the next operation that pushes him there. So he conceives and oversaw probably the most crucial operation of the war, which inflicts a really heavy defeat on the tribes. This is the 12th of May 1937. And the operation is conceived to drive Mir Ali away from his HQ, hopefully out of Waziristan altogether. And it involves converging attacks by 2 brigades in the Sham Valley. And this is set up by a daring night operation, absolutely unprecedented in scope and scale on the frontier before, done by the Banu Brigade across steep, practically trackless hillsides at night. It outflanks the main defence line of sangers. So we talked earlier about how the tribesmen would put up lines of sangers, and it outflanks this defence line, and the tribes see they've been outflanked, and they break and they run. And I think this night operation should be far better known. Its boldness in concept and its skill in execution is absolutely fantastic. And so here it's operating at night, prevented the need for all those slow and cumbersome picketing systems that we talked about earlier. And it was a potential revolution in frontier terms, but it was really risky. It could have gone very wrong because at night you can't bring the overwhelming firepower you have to bear. So it was quite risky, but I think it's a masterstroke, and I think that it's what brings Hartley his promotion. I think well deserved. At the end of it, we see the destruction of Mir Ali's main base of operations, the delightfully named Arsal Kot. It's a small hamlet and a network of flea-infested caves. And on the left-hand side there, I am absolutely sure that this shows the Madras sapper and miners in their distinctive hats, preparing to blow up some of Mir Ali's caves. I think that is a soldier-taken picture on the spot at Arsal Kot in May 1937. It's amazing. Mir Ali himself managed to escape, but these operations broke the main resistance and inflicted a number of casualties. And it's believed that 275 casualties were inflicted on the tribes in the month of May. But more importantly, it broke the morale. We said it was always mercurial, without organisation and discipline. If they had reversers, people tended to leak away. And this happened quite heavily after May. And then further mopping up operations followed. And then the tribes come in to hear terms from the government at the end of August. And this is a jirga. So this is the tribesmen listening to the politicals laying down the law. And, as I said, all the politicals are sat down. They're not stood up. And maybe Barney Barnes is in there with his hands in his pocket. But I think it's a bit warm in this one for that. But minor operations continued. They continued throughout September and October. And November 1937 marks the end of the heavy fighting, and sort of the end of that campaign. There's another summer of clone operations in 38, and as a result, the Frontier Medal, which I have one here.
Hang on, I'll put you on full screen. Hang on. There we go. Yep.
Okay, so you'll see it has two clasps, and the top clasp is 1936 to 1937, and the bottom clasp is 1937 to 1939, showing that the operations that continued were still considered worthwhile. It's quite serious enough to warrant a clasp. And that medal is to a member of the Tochi Scouts, which is why I bought it.
Nice. Really cool. Yeah.
So, and that might be another one to put on full screen quickly, Paul, so you can read the card there. Up to you, of course. But this is a dead soldier's gear, and the card is a deceased soldier's kit card, which I'd never heard of before this photograph. And this is to illustrate the cost of empire. Government forces suffered 312 killed and 893 wounded between the 25th of November 1936 and the 31st of December 1938. The losses we have for the insurgents are 898 dead and 856 wounded, and we think overall that maybe 5,000 to 7,000 Wazirs, and then from across the border, Afghan Waziris, another 4,000 or 5,000 perhaps involved. The government forces overall 60,000, it's said, 39,000 regulars, 5,000 scouts, and 1,000 frontier constabulary for certain, and the rest must have been levies of various sorts. But the figures for the insurgents are a shorter period. That's 25th November 36 to 15th December 37. And looking at the figures, we see a much larger ratio of killed to wounded than you'd expect for the insurgents. But I think this is a combination of poor or non-existent medical facilities and possibly a lack of reporting of minor wounds as well. Okay, nearly there. Determining the lessons learned from these campaigns is easy enough. The official histories, Northwest Frontier, India. Northwest Frontier, India.
Yep, good.
Detail room, and the official publication, Frontier Warfare 1939,
Nice.
contains a distilled knowledge of 92 years of fighting, brought right up, bang up to date. And I read that again recently, and it's all about picketing, essentially. Picketing contains the most of it, and then the second biggest part is air cooperation. So those are clearly the main lessons that were learned in terms of frontier warfare. Discerning the usefulness of what they learned to World War II is much harder. And the extent to which the right lessons were
not as much as they should have done is going to be my simple answer to that.
Possibly. I mean, the whole doctrine of the British Army throughout the whole period of the frontier from 1849 to 1947 was that conventional European warfare bears no resemblance to the frontier whatsoever. Fair enough. The army thought that the frontier taught weapon handling, and especially the ability to read ground. Masters brings this up in Road to Mandalay about how the Japanese attack him at night, and the reason the attack fails is over unsuitable ground, and he's got a Pathan, or is it a Gem? I mean, got a Gurkha officer with him, and the Gurkha officer says, if these Japanese were Pathans, we'd have had a hell of a time here. So,
sorry to interrupt, but we had a quote very early on from Jim Grant. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Brigadier Sir John Smythe, VC, writing after the Second World War, rated the Pathans as the most skilled fighters he'd faced, and he'd fought Germans and Japanese. Yeah. So, there you are.
Individual skirmishing level, absolutely. However, the main Indian Army campaign of World War II is Burma. Mike Tickner covered 1941, 1942, no doctrine. They were fighting jungle warfare. All they'd been taught how to do was fight the Pathans in the hills. But Burma, particularly the 14th Army campaign, it takes place in difficult terrain, check, often without large quantities of heavy equipment, check, against a fierce enemy, check,
Yeah.
And I think 14th Army toiled through the jungles and hills in columns that would have been familiar to frontier officers. And a number of the junior officers who fought on the frontier were slims, colonels, and brigadiers in 1945. And they got their first taste of battle in an arena where, frankly, mistakes equaled death and decisions need to be made very quickly. We've touched on John Masters. Pete Rees was on the frontier as a brigade major. Slim was a Gurkha officer who fought on the frontier in the 20s. And in the Momand campaign of 1935, the two brigadiers were called Auchinleck and Alexander.
Yeah.
So I think there's a base of knowledge of, I think much in the way that you could look at Northern Ireland as the British Army's training ground for the Falklands. Not in terms of terrain or the enemy they're fighting, but in terms of getting used to being shot at, getting used to making decisions, and skillful enemy who would shoot you if you made a mistake.
Yeah, and I think the kind of balance between trying to bring your methods of warfare so that you have an advantage, but at the same time respecting, acknowledging that the enemy won't necessarily play to those rules. That kind of struggle of that the Allies would the government would want to bring in their armored cars and their biplanes and things like that, but at the same time, if the enemy don't want to fit within if the enemy decide not to engage you, I mean, again, things you were saying reminding me of what I've read about the Lakota and Native Americans is that a war campaign would be kind of running, then people would just go home. Tribesmen would just go home because it's time to go back home. They would kind of, yeah, but we're winning now. They would just sort of bugger off. You've got to kind of keep an insurgent army by definition are not there on a wage. They're not there they've not been conscripted. They don't have to follow orders. So that combination of fighting an enemy that is there because they want to be, but also can not want to be there, if that makes sense. So, yeah, taking your warfare to the enemy, but respecting the enemy have a different way, and kind of trying to find that common ground in the middle where you can come out on top.
I think that's a very pertinent point, and I think that would be a very pertinent point if we were having this conversation about Vietnam. Yeah, I think that's one of the definitely parallels. The Americans never quite worked out how to use their overwhelming firepower in a manner.
And the other thing, and I know you were, is what the British then called a couple of decades later the hearts and minds things.
Yes.
If you're fighting an area where it's not your home turf, because the irony of this is the government, it's not technically these people they're fighting are British subjects. You made that very clearly early on, but the British and Indian troops are technically invading this territory as well. In some ways as well, it's theirs, but it's not theirs. That kind of goodies and baddies is blurring the lines a little bit. But one of the things the British absolutely learned when they moved into Malaya and things like that post-war is to try and win over the local population who could be on your side. One of the things the Germans absolutely failed miserably at when they did Operation Barbarossa is that they were taking places that could have easily they had turned against the Soviets, but they didn't. They started killing them in huge numbers, and so these people just saw the Germans as enemies as well. So that hearts and minds element of fighting where you're not necessarily welcome, trying to win over the people who could be loyal to you, in addition to fighting the people who are trying to kill you. It's complicated.
I think this is also something that 14th Army did well and the Japanese did badly.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether there's a lesson that they learned there, perhaps, as well.
Borneo is a good example of the people in Borneo basically being slightly ambivalent to any kind of white people or Asian people coming to there. But if you didn't piss them off too much, they were more likely to show allegiance to you, which is eventually what the Australians and the British did by sending in SOE teams in place into Borneo, where the Japanese kind of went in there going, we could be your friends, but they didn't act like friends. And so the Borneo people who had to sort of choose between two warring empires, neither of which they had any vested interest in. Ultimately, the Allies won because they were nicer to the locals. I mean, I'm simplifying the Borneo campaign considerably there, but I think my point kind of makes some sense.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's the same in Burma. as well, to a certain degree. You know, the Boers were glad to see the back of the British, absolutely, but they're probably slightly even more glad to see the back of the Japanese.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just to wrap up very quickly.
Yep.
So yes, 14th Army was fighting in Burma, but British and Indian troops were also stationed on the frontier throughout World War II, and they suffered casualties, sometimes heavy, particularly in the years the Japanese appeared to be winning. But we also sort of see a bit of Indianization here as well. The Indian Air Force takes over the air support, and the ratio of British troops is reduced, and battalions of the frontier will continually milk to their best officers and NCOs. And just a quick timeline there. But you know, we picked up the Italian agent visiting the Faqir of Ipi, and the German agents in July 41 trying to make their way through Afghanistan. And got into a gunfight with the Afghan army, which is interesting. The big one here, really, for me, is December 1943. A couple of Gurkha regiments of very inexperienced troops were out training from Razmak, and they annoyed the locals, and the locals taught them a lesson and gave them a bit of a kicking. And they chased them all the way back to Razmak, and was fighting on the hockey pitch at Razmak base. And 50 soldiers were killed or wounded. That to me shows that they hadn't learned all the lessons they should have, and the frontier was still a dangerous place. And
well, I mean, we could go down a massive rabbit hole of how many centuries has that part of the world been a less than ideal place to go in and fight. Most of the Western world has found out to their peril over the decades that kind of area
absolutely
is a bit dodgy.
Well, when the British leave, obviously it becomes a problem with the Pakistan government. And Mir Ali continues his activities until he dies in 1961. But I think the Pakistan government pacified the region far better than the British have ever managed. I mean, partly due to the passage of time, partly due to emigration from the frontier, and partly due to it being a Muslim government and Muslims in the region. I think that helped. But the Pakistan government built a lot of roads and schools and hospitals.
Yeah.
How much this would have been possible during the Raj, I don't know. But I always left with the perception that perhaps there was a bit more stick than carrot, and the other way around would have been a good thing.
Yeah, no, I mean,
that ends today's presentation.
Well, you've got to find some kind of balance point in the middle. But anyway, got a couple of questions. Thank you, John. Absolutely extraordinary stuff. So the first one from Ian Carr. Would the British components of these units have been rotated in this period? I mean, when we think of that kind of regular army, you just went overseas and you could be there for years before going back to Blighty. In fact, people had, wives overseas and stuff. Was there rotation, or were you, if you're at the front, you're at the front?
Yes. So the British battalions did a year at a time on the frontier generally, and I said 6 battalions during the actual 1937, but then there's about maybe another 8 or 9 in 38 to 39 as well. I think they definitely rotated through. The Indian battalions were, I think, 2 years out of 6. I think Mike Tickner said that last time. And they spent more time on the frontier, but the British battalions were definitely rotated through, yes.
Okay. So right at the beginning, you talked about how that kind of raiding, looting tradition, in a sense, then evolved into a proper kind of a resistance movement, if you like. And so it's about individual soldiers using their individual movement across the terrain. You did all that. But in terms of the leaders, Jim Walsh asked early on, did any of the tribal leaders have any formal military training whatsoever? I mean, had any of them gone through a system where they had sort of had broad concept of how to move battalions? I mean, not that they're fighting battalions, but there's the question for you.
Well, some of them had periods in the Indian Army or in the Scouts, so there was some knowledge there anyway. But I think I think the method of fighting didn't necessarily require that.
Yeah.
And because they'd spent so much time shooting at each other, they didn't really need to spend much time on a rifle range.
Yeah, they just, again, it's back to what I just said. They just basically adapted what they were doing anyway, rather than trying to
Yes.
beat the government troops in some sort of theoretical warfare they don't understand. They just fought the way they did on a slightly larger thing, which, as you say, didn't necessarily need specific training, because as you, they can shoot because they know how to shoot. They can move across the terrain. They've got the suitable gear to wear in that terrain. So just sort of build from that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. But so going back to what Jim asked, there's no strategic plan, I don't think.
Right.
There's no big overview. There's no, well, we'll attack here and then we'll send a bunch of people off here to do this, anything other than a local level.
And that's why, again, with Rabbit Hole, that's why when you get to some of those other wars where there are sort of certain parallels, we mentioned Vietnam, we've mentioned, the American West and what have you, is you get to that point at a certain point where these wars then become way more than just the peoples on the ground. They become global wars in that, Russia then and China end up having an involvement in Vietnam way beyond the people on the ground there. But of course, this campaign never got to that level where suddenly people start shipping weapons in, saying, we're using you now as a representation of, I'm talking about the kind of the red threat kind of thing. So it's really interesting.
It was a lot less bipolar world. I mean, I think
yes,
China and Russia. Russia's a big power. And Britain's a big power, and they're the two that are rubbing up against each other. And there's, you've heard of the Great Game, and there's always spies percolating up and down between the two. But it never it's not a proxy war. Whereas Vietnam's a proxy war, isn't it? Between the Chinese, between the Russians and the Americans, and I think there's no Patan General Giap. There's no Ho Chi Minh amongst them. They're the guys with the strategic level thinking. And obviously, I think, to be fair, they're much better educated.
Was
it Giap or Ho Chi Minh went to the Sorbonne? Or
something like that. Yeah, spoke French.
They had proper educations, which the tribes guys perhaps didn't.
But as you said, probably didn't need in the sense of the type of warfare they're fighting. No one's handing them, complicated electronic anti-aircraft weapon systems that they couldn't deal with. Last question, and I'm going to answer it as well. Did the British Army in the global war on terror read their predecessors' accounts from the 19th to 20th centuries? Now, I happen to know a friend of mine who I think was in the lifeguards in Afghanistan. His officer was a real history buff and was reading stuff about the 19th century and this very campaign. And when he was trekking out in convoys in Afghanistan, was harking to this sort of campaign. Others, so I know from a personal story, there were definitely officers in the British Army who were looking back 50, 60, and 100 years. But whether it was we'd have to ask someone from Sandhurst or anything whether there was any books, you mentioned those books right at the beginning, whether they were kind of standard texts that people were still reading in the British Army and American armies in the 90s and 2000s. I have no idea.
I don't think so. What I would say is that the fighting the British did in Afghanistan in the 19th century was probably a little different to what we've seen here today. The Afghan army was a thing, and they were much more united, unified, and they put some serious forces into the field.
Yeah, it was an army, whereas this is a.
And there was asymmetric warfare. I know that the American army did read up on the British experiences in Waziristan. There's a book written by an American officer, like a thin pamphlet called Mark Miller or Mark. That looks specifically at that kind of thing. So I know they did that. The British Army, I think the British Army forgot a lot of lessons. When they first went into Afghan in 2003, they very much tried the hearts and minds thing, the not wearing helmets, the growing beards, and all this kind of stuff. But I think that was more based on their experiences in Malaya. I think Malaya cast quite a long shadow. The Australians learned a lot from Malaya, and the Australians in Vietnam were very, very good. The Americans did use Malaya as a principle, and certainly the special forces teams did generally. Whether it was taught as the British experience, whether it's just taught as a tactic, I don't know.
Okay.
Great stuff. I don't think Waziristan formed any part of the British thinking for Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you. So, well, I mean, extraordinary stuff. So, as I always say, folks, don't forget to click like and subscribe. In this case, I'm adding another. I'm just going to put a quick Q code up there. This is the link to Jon's eBay bookstore. So, if you've enjoyed the show and you think that Jon guy deserves some beer money over the weekend, and you're looking for a nice military book to buy yourself as a post-Christmas, New Year thing, have a little pop onto his eBay thing and find yourself a nice World War II book or other period of history, whatever it is, and aviation, whatever, and have it sent to you there as a way of thanking Jon for his appearance today. So there you are. There's the link is also in the description below in the text there, but there you are there. Scan that, go and buy a book, make his day. How does that sound, folks?
You're right. Yeah. Every time someone buys a book from me, it makes my day. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jon, I mean, I was looking forward to this, but actually it surpassed what I was expecting. And I already had high expectations, but it just went really well. And I think everybody was watching it, as I said, making parallels to whatever war they've read about. There are parallels to American-Indian wars, to Vietnam, to previous wars. And I think, unfortunately, you're kind of right there in that the British Army, along with other armies, tends to learn things and then forget them partially and then have to relearn them again and again. That's why studying history is interesting, because you go, why didn't they carry on doing that? But, they're the questions. So,
but first of all, I will go and, perhaps a couple of days' time, I will go and look through the comments and the sidebar and look to answer any questions that I can. Secondly, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thirdly, I was getting a little bit worried when we were at slide 19 after an hour. Yeah. I thought we
sped up in the middle. The middle bit got a bit faster. It was good. It was fun. It was really good stuff. And folks, like I say, I'm scheduling shows thick and fast over the next few weeks. I'm really looking for the Monday show where we're looking at a young Bosnian Jew who ended up fighting with Tito's partisans. So the point of view of a very young person. And I haven't done enough content on the war in Yugoslavia in World War II. So I'm looking forward to that one. Loads more stuff. We've got spies. We've got aviation. We've got Pacific. We've got Eastern Front. We've got a guest from Iceland coming up in a few weeks' time. So that'll be my guest from my 40th country coming up. So as always, click like and subscribe. But I will see you after weekend. I'm recording a podcast, the edition of the We're Not Lost podcast with Joe Muccia and Reg Jans. We'll be talking about our experience with veterans, recording that tomorrow. So as always, lots to do, but thank you very much. Thank you, Jon. I will see you on the other side of the weekend. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, Paul. Bye.